All right, everyone, we're going to get started. So thank you all for coming out tonight to this event. We have two wonderful speakers, and it's going to be very interesting. Before we begin, we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. So we wish to acknowledge the land on which University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land for the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit River. Today, the digital space and conceptual place that we are meeting in, as well as the meeting place of the Toronto, are still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. While we recognize that not everyone is sharing the same space during this time, we encourage you to take the time to think about, learn, and reflect upon where you are and the Indigenous peoples who have lived there, are currently there, and the future generations who will live there. As people living on this land, it's essential for us to reflect the ethos and respect that the Indigenous communities show towards the land and towards each other. We must show support through our actions, not just our words for those of us who are occupying this land. Right. So tonight we'll be having two speakers, Julia. So Julia is an urban designer as well as a registered urban planner in Ontario and the United Kingdom. As a doctoral candidate at Harvard, she is a member of the Urban Theory Lab, a Canada Fellow at Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, and has completed a doctoral specialism in critical media practice. Julia's research is situated in urban and landscape theory and political ecology, and aims to render the visible impacts of policy that connect resource territories to urban processes. Within this context, her recent work traces the rise of incentivized environmental conservation in Southern Ontario, focusing on forest landscapes. Her talk will explore how she got into urban forestry through her urban design degree at Daniels. And we also have Jackie. Jackie Hamilton is a forester, arborist, and admirer of trees and all the people that live with them. A 2015 graduate of U of T's MFC, she has worked on and led urban and peri-urban forestry and applied research projects in the GTA and continues to work on forest conservation in and around cities. Jackie has experience working in the environmental science and forestry in the UK and Eastern Ontario. Welcome both. So I believe Julia will be starting our talk tonight with her presentation.
Sure, thank you so much. Let me just share my screen and then I can jump in. Can you guys see that? Nicole, I can just see you on my screen. Yep, okay.
Yep, we can see it.
Perfect. Great, so hi everyone. I wanted to start by saying a huge thank you to Nicole and Juliet and Zoe for inviting me to speak today about my career in research since I left the Master of Urban Design program at Daniels. So actually, before starting the Master of Urban Design program I believe it was in 2012, a while ago now, I'd already been working as a professional planner, both in the UK and in Toronto for a couple of years. And I had, especially practicing in the UK, there was maybe less of a design component in Toronto, and I was interested in scaling up. So in order to get that studio experience, I applied for the program at U of T, and that sort of was the reason why I came there, and then forestry sort of followed. So I figured rather than giving the exact path that I've gone through, that it might be useful to just highlight a couple of key moments that really set me along my particular path that intersects on my now work with forests in my doctoral degree. And actually, one of these key moments was during the master's program here at U of T, where there was the opportunity to do a fellowship at the Canadian Center for Architecture in the summer of 2012. And so I applied and got in, and it was a graduate summer research program offered by the CCA, where with two other architecture students who were coming from schools across Canada, we would be able to do a project on a particular theme. So the theme happened to be the forest. And now you can see it was really my work or being a master's student at U of T that got me into forestry. So I went and did this summer program at the Canadian Center for Architecture. This was also the summer that Dan Handel was working on his exhibition at the CCA called First the Forest, which was an exhibition that positioned forest as design environments. And it was both sort of a written publication and exhibition at the CCA. So that was super influential. That was going on around me. And then I was working with two other fantastic graduate students, Benoit Le Glacé and Mark Wojcik. And we together investigated the idea of the design of the forest clearing. And so we came up with we'll see if this loads. Maybe it's a little bit, you can see it down here, but I've got a bigger version. It's spinning, it's thinking about it. So it's a large map. But together we investigated this idea of the forest clearing and documented different ways that the clearing of forest is sort of a designed environment and the way that there's sort of a spatial logics of the clearing that's inherent to a Canadian context. Forward, there we go. So we produced this map document for the CCA and we did a public presentation where sort of on the first side of this map, we were sort of looking at different ways that clearing occurred. And then on the other side, we were looking at sort of the weird logics and mutations and sort of almost the weirdest things we could find in terms of what that clearing actually entailed and who was involved. So after working all summer on that project at CCA, I was trying to figure out, well, what am I going to do for my master's thesis at U of T? And it just seemed like a natural progression to work from research I'd done over the past summer. And so I actually ended up building out my final master's thesis with on the topic of the forest and looking at a specific site in Southern Ontario, where I looked at different silvicultural strategies and gave attention to both the lifespan of buildings and of trees, and came up with a design proposal for a particular site. So at that point, I thought I was done with forest for the time being. And after graduating, I was really lucky to continue working with my master's thesis advisor, who's Mason White, who's still at Daniels. So I ended up jumping on some projects that they had at Lateral Office and some work that they were doing in the Canadian Arctic. So I won't go into too much more detail on that work at the office, but I should say that the way of working that the office sort of uses and the combination of sort of a design research approach really informed my own understanding and interest in design and research and the relationship between them. And at the same time, I was teaching at Ryerson University in the planning department as an adjunct lecturer. And then after a couple of years realized, you know what, I'd actually like to give academia a try. So I applied to do my doctorate at Harvard and was lucky enough to get in. And so I jumped into the doctorate in 2015 and moved down to Cambridge in the US. And so this is actually where I've been ever since. And this is well timed because I actually just defended on Wednesday and passed. So I am well on my way on becoming a doctor of design in this case. And so at Harvard, my research sort of built from this previous research that I'd done during my master's degree at the CCA with Benoit and Mark. And my current research looks at the connection between forests and urbanization as one mechanism through which governments and also non-state actors have the ability to bring about positive change in relation to sustainability and also in addressing climate change. And so the research is situated within urban planning, political ecology, and environmental design. And it focuses on incentivized forest management as historically embedded within processes of urbanization and in also broader political changes in Canada and the US as well. So the research looks at incentivized landscapes sort of first and foremost, and it sort of positions incentivized landscapes alongside more theoretical research on the production of nature. And it looks at how these programs shape the capacities of those involved, while also affecting their perceptions of these landscapes. So this includes a new material relationship, where the forest environments are shaped through a combination of scientific forestry, state goals, local context, and the agency of human and non-human nature. In particular, I've been looking at the Managed Forest Tax Incentive Program, which gives a property tax reduction to landowners who are engaged in the active management of their properties. And I'm interested in the labor that's involved in the stewardship of these landscapes, and also breaking down what active management actually entails in terms of forest stewardship. So in addition, I also sort of bring a political, economic, and planning lens to the study of these spaces by looking at the invisible policy layers that to an extent inform the management decisions that are taking place here. So here I look at the role of taxation in providing sort of an abstracted programmatic overlay. And in particular, I've been drawing from scholars such as Robertson and Kelly Kay, who offer sort of critical perspectives in regard to ecosystem service markets and also conservation easements, which have become popular as a solution to addressing environmental issues. So in this case, through the use of sort of diagramming, I've been interested in looking at sort of the invisible layer that to a certain degree directs how these programs play out both at the site-based scale, but also at a more territorial scale as well. And in visualizing the invisible implementation of these rules, looking at sort of the legal elements of property and how these give rise to an ecological accounting that has real spatial impacts. I know that this is a brief talk, so I'm going to sum up with just some of my work as part of my media practice, and then I'll conclude. So alongside my doctoral dissertation, I've been also doing sort of a secondary specialism in critical media practice at Harvard, which is a secondary specialism that at the School of Art, Film, and Visual Studies. And it integrates media production into your scholarly work, both as process and also as outcome. So I had to not only defend a written dissertation, but I also had to defend like a video-based media project as well, which when I signed up for the program sounded like a great thing, but trying to finish up has been harder than I thought. So as part of the secondary, through my sort of research, especially my field work, I've been using video to document the various landscapes that are coming out of the incentive programs and also the kinds of labor that are involved as well in forest stewardship. So in this case, along with some serious writing, it's been nice to also have this creative outlet in video practice that aims to connect these geographically dispersed and often unrecognized combinations of human and non-human activity across the region of Southern Ontario in this case. And that is where I'll leave it in terms of my career trajectory. So tried to just pull out a couple key bits of where I started with getting into work on forests and forestry, which was at Daniels and at U of T. And it sort of followed me in my career path, and it's where I've ended up. Luckily, it's not a bad topic to be studying, especially when you get to do 5 years of summer fieldwork in forests in Southern Ontario. Let me stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Thank you for the talk. That was really interesting. Now we will have Jackie present her presentation as well.
Okay, thanks so much, Julia. That was a really interesting talk. Got lots of questions for you myself, so I'm sure others do too. So I'm going to similarly kind of walk through a few interesting, or what I think might be interesting, points in my career thus far in urban forestry. And then hopefully we'll leave a lot of time for questions and discussion. So I wanted to take a step back actually, because I think understanding what high school Jackie, 18-year-old Jackie looked like and thought would be really helpful in understanding what shaped my career. So coming out of high school, I knew a few things. I knew I really loved the environment. I knew that I was super into science, and I knew that I wanted to be somewhere where I had friends and family. So this sent me to the University of Ottawa, where I studied environmental science. And I loved my program. And after the program ended, I worked for a little bit in consulting, but felt I really wanted to come back to school and specifically focus on kind of the ecological side of environmental science, which brought me to the Masters of Forest Conservation program. And I'm not going to walk through all of my, career path or every job that I've had. I think there's kind of two groupings and themes in the work that I've done to date. But just so everyone knows, these are some of the organizations I've worked for. So some of them are kind of public sector and then private consulting, as well as not-for-profits and a conservation authority, all primarily in the kind of GTA. So the first, when I first graduated from the MSc program, I was lucky enough to get an internship in the UK where I worked for a silvicultural consulting company. This was through the Canadian Institute of Forestry's program, which I highly recommend that you look into. And there I got to learn a lot about forest management, and it was my first kind of taste of working directly with landowners and on their, their objectives for their land. It was a lot of small scale forestry on large estates. And then I came back to Toronto and I worked for the not-for-profit LEAF, which is based in Toronto and kind of spread out to the Greater Toronto area. But they have a few different programs around urban forestry, and the primary one is their residential tree planting program, which I coordinated. So we went out to meet homeowners and discuss what they were looking for in a tree for their backyard or front yard, and then we'd help them select the proper species for their site conditions, and then we'd go back and plant it for them. And through this process, it really solidified my kind of love for urban forestry and the idea that of working both in forests in the city. So I got to know the forest within the Toronto area, but also working with people and learning, what draws them to love nature in the city. And after a couple years of that kind of field-based work, I got more into the research side of things. So in working at the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, I did a lot more desk work, if you will. I was out inside the office more and outside less, which is kind of a sad trade-off, but I did get to do a lot of interesting research work there, and I continue to do this kind of work at the Greenbelt Foundation. So primarily my research work is working with academics and consultants in public health and economics and ecology to bring together the kind of human value that nature can provide to people in cities. And so I think there are a few themes in this work as well, mostly climate change adaptation and public health. So I've done quite a bit of work with looking at where to prioritize planting and growing urban forests as a priority for reducing extreme heat, for example, in cities. And then also looking at access. So is there more access to parkland and different types of nature, and kind of the equity questions around that. And I am now working on a near urban nature strategy. So that's a kind of larger scale than I've worked at previously, but for the whole greater Golden Horseshoe, it's called, which is basically like the Greenbelt and expanded beyond to include Lake Simcoe. And we're looking again at those kind of human benefits of nature, as well as the underlying ecological benefits of maintaining and enhancing those green spaces. I thought I'd touch on just a few things that I think came from my MSc, and I'm sure the other programs listening in have similar kind of things that you can pull from your program. So in my work in a kind of applied research sense, there's obviously, I rely on the topics that we covered, like the information that I got from the program. But even more so, I think in increasing order, I would say that I benefited from working with people from different backgrounds. Like the program itself allowed me to get to know different people from different academic backgrounds as well, which has become really important in the work that I'm doing now. Because as I say, I work with academics that are in economy, ecology, and they speak different languages, and you almost need a translation between them. And so in my program, I kind of started to get that language down, which grew over time. And then also obviously contacts. So I run into MSCs and just other U of T grads, as I'm sure everyone here does, just out and about in my work. But most importantly, the friends that I gained in the program, I've kept in touch with and have been really helpful throughout my career. And then a few helpful things that I started during or just after the MSc, and maybe I went a little too gung-ho on some of these things, but I was really into attending conferences, and when you're a student, you can attend a lot of conferences for free. So I highly recommend you look into and go to as many as you can while they're free. It's a little weirder in these times because they're all virtual, but some of them still cost money. So there are student scholarships you can get for covering cost conferences. And then the other thing is mentorship. So I was involved in an organization called Emerging Leaders for Biodiversity, and they're still around. And they have a mentorship program, LEAF, which I worked at, but then continued to volunteer at after working there. Also has a Young Urban Forest Leaders program. And then the Ontario Professional Foresters Association, which I'm registered with as a professional forester. In that process, you have to have a mentor. And I got a lot of value out of my mentors, and I still ask them questions today. And I've now moved into the role of mentor. So I continue that kind of relationship that I really value with mentees today. And then finally, volunteering. So there's a lot of different organizations that are working in urban forestry that are always looking for volunteers and help. And I think even if it wasn't an immediate connection, over time, if you volunteer and go to events, don't overdo it and overstretch yourself, obviously, but you do end up pulling on those connections in the long term. So just some of the more kind of fun volunteering that I've done or events that I've participated in. I was on the board of the Ontario Urban Forest Council, and they have a conference every year, which again, for students, I think is free or very low cost. And they also have a mentorship program. There's a really great event run out of Fleming College called Women in Trees. Again, it didn't run this year, obviously, but hopefully it will be back soon. And it's just a really inspiring event that had, hundreds of women who were learning to climb trees, which I had never done before. And then there are lots of other things, I like to volunteer with kind of arts and children camps too, because they bring a new perspective and kind of keep me inspired for working in the work that I do. As I mentioned, LEAF has the Young Urban Forest Leader program, which you can look into. And the outcome of that is building a stewardship plan with a community group. So this is a group that I worked with in Birksea Park in Toronto. And we got to be part of the opening event for that park, which was also the kind of kickoff for the Adopt a Tree program that we were running in the park. And a lot of the mentees that were coming through this program were also from the MFC program. And then continued learning. So the ISA has a lot of courses you can take online, and they are I think probably everyone's familiar with them, but they're the arborist certification body. And in going through to become an arborist, you have to keep up with your continued learning as well as being a registered professional forester. But beyond those kind of requirements that I have to do, I've also found a lot of value in just keeping up with academic learning. So I'm taking a course at the University of Amsterdam right now that's really interesting. It's about the Anthropocene. And I'll just leave it before we start our discussion with some advice for the job search. So the first thing obviously is to make sure that you can live on the salary and benefits. I think when I first graduated, there was, it didn't come easy. I didn't get a job right away. And knowing what you can survive on as well as your worth is really important when you're first looking for a job. And trying new things. So I applied for some jobs that maybe I didn't fit the job description to a T, and they ended up being jobs that I actually fell into and really enjoyed. And then finally, finding a culture that you're comfortable with. So, I've found that the people that I've worked with is really the most important thing about the places that I've worked. So with that, I will thank you all for listening, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
Thank you, Jackie, for your presentation. So now we're going to move into the moderated question part of the evening. So I'll be asking questions along with two of my colleagues from the What's Next series, Juliet and Nicole. And then we'll be able to open it up to the floor for any questions. For the Q&A session with the audience, if you feel comfortable, please turn on your camera. If not, you can always enter a question into the chat and one of us will be happy to read it for you. So I'll go ahead and start as a question for both of you. So do you have any key pieces of advice for students that are close to graduating?
Julia, do you want to start?
No, go ahead.
Yep. Okay. Key pieces of advice. I guess I had a few in that presentation. I think my most key piece of advice is to enjoy the end of your program. And I know that sounds like not helpful advice, but I do think that things fall into place. Like I said, after graduating, I had an internship over the summer, but other than that, I was working like random part-time jobs to support myself. And I think I was applying to dozens of jobs without any kind of strategy for what I was applying for because I was just panicked. And I would recommend not doing that, not applying to jobs that you have no shot of getting or even really want to do. That's it. From a good learning from my life.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in and second the don't apply for jobs that you don't want to take. I think I definitely was panicking last year around this time in terms of applying for a bunch of things and probably spent too much time on applications and less in terms of trying to finish up the actual work I was trying to do, and maybe didn't enjoy the last stages as much as I could have. So it's a bit of a balance about getting a couple of things out there that you're pretty passionate about, perhaps. And it's nice to have something that you can go directly into. And I've had two experiences where I graduated from my sort of Master's of Urban Planning in 2009, 8 or 9, where that last recession hit us. So I definitely was struggling quite a bit during that time and was working part-time for an urban design firm in the UK. And it did help to have a bit of work that was associated with the degree I'd done, but I honestly took on a part-time job doing something else just to make ends meet. But because I was doing at least part-time something I was really interested in, it was fine. And then after I finished at the Master of Urban Design program at U of T, I was able to jump on and work with my advisor more at lateral office. So that was a really nice transition as well. So if there is someone that you end up maybe doing an internship with over one summer and you really like that work, it's always nice to be able to reach out to some of your networks and see if they might have something coming up.
I have the next question. So this is also for both of you. We know going into the workforce, it's good to have a lot of connections you can talk with, and going to conferences are usually a good place to make those connections. Jackie, you brought up that you've gone to a few. I'm wondering, do either of you have a specific conference that you would recommend, or any of them that you like had quite enjoyed over the others?
I can start this one off with a couple that I would recommend. I actually, as a master's student, was way too intimidated to present at any conferences. I definitely went to a couple, but it was only once I started my doctorate that I was like, okay, I've got to buck up and do this and put my work out there. It's so personal, right? But if you are able, and you realize it's not as scary as you think, and everyone is so supportive. So as a master's student, if you're doing a really great final thesis or you have a paper that you would like to present, I would encourage you to do that, because a lot of it's great to get the work out there and people are really receptive. I went to a really great conference and I'm not quite sure if it is on at the moment because of COVID, but I went to a conference a couple of years back called Wood at Work that was led by Scott Francisco. A while ago, it was in Montreal. I think it was in Toronto a couple of years back, but that was really nice because it was quite small and you really got to meet everyone who was presenting and everyone who was attending. The conference that I usually go to every year and present at is the American Association of Geographers. And that's honestly it's the other spectrum where like, it was really nice at this Wood at Work conference to have such a small group. And at the AAG, it's just thousands of people. Like you are it's a giant pond with very many fish in it. So it's nice because you get a certain anonymity, but you also get to meet a lot of people from sort of coming from all kinds of different disciplines who sort of intersect in geography. So that's my sort of go-to in terms of seeing what's out there at the moment. And there's definitely relevance with forestry there as well as urban planning and urban design.
Yeah, that's great. To add to that, a couple of similar, like on the smaller scale side of things that I've been to. I mean, Forest Ontario has a conference every year that I've been to for several years, and it's a good, it's not huge, and it's a good community of people working in forestry. So I think you start to see some of the same names and faces there. And similarly, the Ontario Urban Forest Council, which I'm promoting because I used to be on their board and help run their conferences, but they were like even smaller and more intimate, and a good mix of like community members, academics, and municipal staff. And so I think those kinds of conferences are interesting when there's people from so many different backgrounds. And then on the big side of things, the North American Congress for Conservation and Biodiversity is I don't know if I got that name right, but anyway, that's, that's another big giant one that's across North America. And so it's similar to the American Geographer Association, I think, in that it's like really inspiring, and there's too many talks, you couldn't go to all of them. But it is on the other end of things, a really inspiring thing to see what's happening in other places.
Thanks so much, guys. Those were both really, really inspiring. I think we're going to move into we have a couple specific questions, and then we want to make sure that we have time for questions from the audience. Julia, I was curious about kind of your experience working in design and then kind of going out into the field, and wondering if you can speak to that. And then I'm also particularly interested in the film component to your doctorate, and if you could describe how film, if you find it's kind of supplemented how you communicate information, or kind of how the feedback between maybe the written portion of your work and the film portion.
Great, yeah, thanks, Juliet. Really great questions. In terms of going from the design field into sort of forestry, which was sort of the first one, I guess I feel like I'm a bit of an outsider in this case. My background originally in like my undergrad was geography, and I did a biology sort of minor in that. So I did a lot of the biology stuff sort of earlier on, and then haven't really gone back, but have come full circle now in terms of, I'm finding that actually that experience and doing that biology minor really informative for the work that I'm doing now. Yeah, I know when I was doing my field work and talking with landowners, and we'd be walking through their managed forests, often they would ask me maybe what I would recommend in some case, and I had to politely tell them I wasn't quite sure, because it's not really, I'm not specialized in that. And so it was really, I was learning from them quite a bit of the time, and bringing sort of a urban planning and design lens to the study of that work. In terms of the film component, that was something that was one of these unexpected things that sort of comes along and has really made the research, the methodology really changed. Like it was very much integrated into the dissertation as a whole, and both informed my research questions and my writing, as well as just how I engaged in fieldwork as well. So bringing film, like bringing a video component, really changed like how I would even do the field work. So I had to spend a lot more time at these sites. It was also, I would often revisit them several times as well to get a sense of, I would go and talk with landowners, and they would be so lovely about sort of explaining what they were managing for and taking me on tours of the site. And I would probably take some photos and brief bits of video, and then would be able to revisit. And there's something about working with a time-based media that sort of structures how you sit in spaces and what you hear and what you decide to capture and what you frame. And so it definitely added a different way of seeing to my work, and even to knowledge too, like a sort of an artistic research-based practice, just to sort of, and that's still something that I'm grappling with in terms of like, well, what does that mean and how does it have a sort of vital place in terms of scholarship as well. So in the dissertation, I've tried to weave it in as much as I can, but it's sort of to be continued in terms of it's something I'd like to continue to do now that I'm done as well in future research.
Thank you. I think I'm in the architecture program, and I know I'm in thesis, and a lot of people are trying to figure out ways of integrating different media into like written with photography or whatever. So I think that will be a helpful answer.
So actually, I have a question for you, Jackie. So in your presentation, you mentioned that finding a culture is really important in your workplace. Do you find that the culture changes based on like what sort of sector you're working in, the company, the business, the people you surround yourself with, or is it an amalgamation of all of those things?
Yeah, I think it varies definitely by sector and even organization. And even organizations, in my experience, they can change over time, like a new leadership or some political changes can change the vibe at a workplace, for lack of a better word. And I do think that that's been like one of the most important things for whether I felt happy in a position is just generally like how the workplace, what the values of the workplace are. And I think some of those things you can pick up on if you're in the job searching stage. You can look on things like Glassdoor and get some insight in the reviews, but also I wouldn't hesitate to like actually reach out to current employees, especially if it's a larger organization, and get a sense from them, depending on, even in larger organizations, different teams can have different feelings and dynamics. And so, I would suggest not being shy in reaching out to people at any organization that you're interested in working with or just learning more about, because people are pretty perceptive to that. I know people have done it to me, and I definitely don't think it's weird, or I think when I was in school, I definitely didn't have the gall to do that. But looking back on it, I'm like, why didn't I? Might have saved me some trouble.
Thank you. That's really insightful and very helpful, I'm sure, for all of our current students in the graduate program.
Now, before we get into questions from the audience, since Jackie and Julia, this is your first time meeting each other now, we're wondering if you have any questions for yourselves.
I do actually. I do. I've got lots of questions for Julia, just because your work sounds so fascinating. But I guess working at the Greenbelt Foundation now, I don't know if your work was in or intersected the Greenbelt, or if you know that, but I'd be interested to know that.
I'm sure that I was looking generally at the region, like Southern Ontario, so the Greenbelt was definitely in there. In terms of I did a couple more like quantitative analysis as well, looking at the actual, I was able to get some data from MPAC for property tax in terms of programs. Again, not personal data of who's involved, but at least some pinpoints to sort of show where these programs are falling. So there was definitely areas there that were in the Greenbelt. So it was interesting to see like where programs were overlapping. And that's sort of where this overlap of policy comes in as well that I was looking at, like what are the different layers? Yeah, I don't know if that answers, like I've definitely looked at like visited sites that are near or close, but it hasn't really factored in as like a central aspect.
I was wondering if maybe it was one of those policy layers you looked at, but also, I mean, in the work that I'm doing now, we're looking at some of these programs, like incentive programs for landowners for increasing stewardship. I think there's like, I don't know, it's around 50% that are even participating in either the conservation or the managed forest tax incentive programs. And so it'd be interesting to hear how the landowners you talked to felt about those programs too. Were they?
Yeah, honestly, one of the most enjoyable things about doing this work was being able to meet landowners and talk with them. Like, I've never met a more excited group about the kind of work that they're doing. It was just the most positive experience. And I learned so much from them as well. They were so eager to share all this knowledge they had of their land. Yeah, I could talk for hours about, but it was sort of the best experience was learning about forestry. And maybe it's just the study that I did, and like definitely in terms of finding people, I had to do more of a snowball methodology. So it might have just been positive people passing me on to more positive people who absolutely loved the program. But generally, those who were in it were very grateful to be in it. And there was always a little bit of confusion about why more people didn't know about it somehow. Though, yeah, it seemed like it was a lot of word of mouth, and also working with sort of some of the organizations that had outreach as well. But a lot of landowners seemed to think, or seemed to hear about it through friends who are already in the program. So it seemed to be a very word of mouth kind of sort of passing on details about the program.
Julia, do you have any questions for Jackie?
I'm sure I do. I'm also just so interested in, I guess, in terms of how your career has sort of, when did you know it was sort of the right move to jump to different career options as you were going through? And it sounds like you had that amazing experience in the UK, but it seems like you've sort of, for the most part, have you stayed in sort of like Southern Ontario? And I was wondering, because it seems like you've worked a lot of different firms in the same region, if there's anything from working at those different areas that sort of is surprising or interesting in terms of how different organizations are approaching urban forestry.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I mean, for most of the time since graduating, I've worked at the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, which is like a watershed-based kind of regional organization. And prior to that, as I mentioned, I worked at LEAF, which is like people's backyards. So there was like a scaling up there. And then now I'm at the Greenbelt Foundation, which is even bigger regionally, although it's still Southern Ontario and a small portion really of Southern Ontario. And it's just like turtles all the way down. The problems are repeating at every level. Like they're very similar, I'm finding, whether it's someone in their backyard and the kind of cultural, ecological, economic dynamics that come into how many trees do I plant, what types of trees, what do I want my world to look like? And then you scale that up to like many landowners across the Greenbelt, and it's very similar. So the work that I've done, I find there's like repeating themes of like the urgency of climate change, the benefits of trees, and people's like strange and interesting cultural relationships with trees.
So we did have a question from someone. We have students applying to Daniels coming from undergrad, and they are wondering how you managed to feel prepared for that experience. So I guess kind of if you can remember back to your undergrad selves. I know both of you have mentioned either undergrad or high school. So maybe you can channel those inner beings and speak to how you prepared for the application, how you felt, and what that process looked like.
Sure, I don't know. Jackie, did you want to start, or?
You can go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, in terms of applying for Daniels for undergrad, like I'm trying to think of applying for my undergrad in geography. I don't think there was much of an application package to put together, but I'm sure for undergrad Daniels, they probably want a portfolio or something like that. Honestly, I'm sure that they're looking for sort of your ability to learn new things and the skills that you might have already. But I guess like I can speak maybe about like applying for a master's portfolio, or for, I don't know, Daniel's, honestly, I think if you can just display that you have sort of a creativity and that you can approach questions from different directions and think spatially, I think you're going to be well on your way. I don't think there's any expectation that you would be able to do a lot of complex drawings when you apply. I think it's just your enthusiasm for the program that should come through. I don't know, Jackie, maybe I'll pass it on to you. It's been a long time since I applied to undergrad.
Yeah, was it the question about applying to undergrad or?
Sorry, I may have misspoken. It was applying coming from undergrad, so applying to master's.
Yeah, I think Julia's answer still probably applies in a lot of sense, or at least in my experience. You had to. I didn't apply to Daniels, so when I went to the faculty of forestry, it was a separate faculty. So I don't know if this even applies, but I think coming with like a sense of being ready to learn and not being too worried about like what skill sets you already have is a good way to enter any master's program, because you are there to learn. And while I think I was probably very nervous when I started my master's, as I'm sure a lot of people are, I also, like, looking back on it now, I look back on it so fondly, and I'm excited for you. Yeah, and good luck with it. I don't have any specific things except to say that I think you'll enjoy it, and don't worry too much about it.
Yeah, maybe sorry, I think maybe I had misunderstood the question, but if it's applying for a master's, I would just say, if you're putting a portfolio together, that rather than quantity, just focus on quality of what you're putting together, and a couple of examples of your best work really goes a long way. I think the sort of people who are looking at your applications will get a sense from a couple of drawings and a couple of projects that you might have worked on, sort of what you're interested in and your skills.
All right, so we have one more question in the chat here. It's from a student. It says, "Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering if you could speak about the role of mentorship throughout your time as a student and as you started working."
I can start with this one. I think there's formal ways you can get or give mentorship. You can go through kind of formal programs, like I mentioned, Emerging Leaders for Biodiversity as an example, or LEAF. They have these, formalized programs where you apply, you get set up, and that's really good if you're like looking for new contacts. But I think there's other informal ways too, where you can take mentorship where you can get it. Like if you are working with someone that you would like to have some traits that they have or learn some skills, you don't even, although it's like nice and flattering, and maybe you can ask them if they're interested in mentoring you. You also can just find the mentorship yourself. Like you can just get that from the person by developing a relationship or working on a project with them. So I think I maybe in my master's and undergrad had an idea that a mentor was like someone you were like formally set up with as a mentor, and you asked them and they said yes. But I'm definitely learning more and more throughout my career that's not all a mentor can be. Hopefully that's helpful.
I think that informal mentorship is key. Maybe I'm forgetting someone, but I can't think of a lot of more like formal mentors that I've had. I think they've mostly been people that I've encountered at school or in the offices that I've worked for that were maybe a little bit ahead of me career-wise, and whose work I really admired, or on whose team I was working on. And I guess professionally, like they're just so useful in terms of being able to, ask them out for a cup of coffee and just sort of explain where you were hoping your career might go, and if they had any suggestions. Actually, my decision to go back to school to Daniels was based on a mentor that I had at an office I was working at before I started the program, who I sort of was like, I really want to get more into design. And she was like, well, then maybe this would be a good option. And really having her support was one of the reasons why I decided to take a risk and sort of go from a planning to a more design focus. I also within, like, as if there are students sort of working through their undergrad or master's here as well, finding someone who's maybe a year ahead in the program or a couple years ahead who can sort of give you some clues in terms of maybe what to avoid and what to do. I definitely have a peer mentor in my doctoral program who he was a year ahead of me. He's graduated now, but he basically, we would sit down a couple times a year and he would just be like, Julia, let me tell you what not to do. Let me tell you all the mistakes I made this year. Don't do it. And inevitably I would. Like, one of his key recommendations is like, start writing your dissertation early. Definitely did not follow that. Should have started earlier. But which I think it's you know, and I have people who have started the program below me who I sort of serve as an informal mentor for as well. So I will now be passing on my peer mentor Mariano's guidance to those who are sort of coming up in their like first and second year and being like, don't do what I did. Make sure you start writing early, or this is a great fellowship to apply for, or this is a really great opportunity. I think I got a lot out of those more informal connections.
That said, I want to give a shout out to my mentee who's listening in on this call through the Ontario Professional Foresters Association, which is also another formal mentorship avenue for anyone that's in forestry that I don't think I mentioned.
Great. So if anyone from the audience has one more question, we have time for just one more. You can feel free to turn your mic on or post the question in the chat for us to read. All right, so I think that actually concludes our event here. We would like to say a big, huge thank you to our speakers. And we've also posted the link in the chat to a feedback form. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the event and what you liked. Again, thank you everyone for coming tonight. And thanks again to our speakers for a very informative, wonderful talk. So everyone else have a great night.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you all for coming.
Thanks all for listening.